Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So here's something really a little bit different. So this is one of my workshop areas in my garage. This is actually the same room that I normally film in. You've got the garage doors behind me normally. So you're getting to see my workbench here, which actually, this is actually fairly tidy for Matt's workbench. I have to say, I tidied it up recently. But I thought you might enjoy, I was going to do a little bit of a project. So I expect, like lots of you out there, I'm quarantined. So I probably had corona a couple of weeks ago actually, but my wife Lucy has had it. She's now recovered. It's nasty. It's like a nasty cold. Don't panic about it. But we're quarantined, so we're stuck inside. And so therefore I'm getting lots of jobs done that I've had hanging around for ages. But I'm also doing some things that, because I've got perhaps a little bit more time, although I have to say juggling kids and doing my three businesses from home is challenging, shall we say, as I'm sure it is for lots of you. But I can't complain. I'm very, very lucky. I've got lots of space, got lots of things to do, lots of swords, lots of weapons. Now you might notice I'm holding a spearhead. And that's really why I'm filming this. So I'm going to look at ways that you can turn a blunt, I kind of hesitate to call it completely blunt, but let's call it blunt for a second, and I'll explain a bit more in a second. Turn a blunt spearhead into a sharp spearhead. So this was purchased basically as a kind of living history reenactment spearhead, made by quite a good maker. One of the Sulowski brothers in Poland, who makes swords more famously, and he also makes axes and spears, and I bought a couple of spearheads. In fact, I think I bought about 4 spearheads off him, but I sold a couple. And I've still got a couple hanging around, and they're very, very nicely made, but they don't have edges on them. They are kind of pointy though. They're too pointy for reenactment, so that's why. Hence, I hesitate to describe them as reenactment spears, but they're not quite living history or sharp spears either. So I'd like to turn it into a living history sharp spear. This shape of head, incidentally, is quite typical of the 14th, 15th century. It's got a very, very strong, let's have a look at the spearhead rather than my face. Come on camera, there we go. It's got a very strong midrib, as you can probably see. Very sturdy spear, and it's for quite a big shaft. So this will go on a fat shaft at some point. So it'll be, this is kind of like a hardcore armoured fighting spear of the type that was used in the time of the treatises that we study, you know, from Fiore all the way through to kind of Maya. Yes, I'm going to try and put an edge on this. Now, there are several ways of achieving that. You can just do it with hand tools. You could just do it with a file. That would be quite a good way of doing it. Quite tidy, less likely to mess anything up if you're not so skilled with tools, with power tools. You could do this with a belt grinder. You could do this with a disc cutter. I'm going to do it with a grinding wheel, which actually is quite an old school way, although obviously mine is electric powered, but they had grinding wheels in the medieval period of various sizes. They were used for grinding and also for polishing and sharpening. So in medieval art we see big grinding wheels used for putting, you know, like actually sharpening an edge of a sword. We also see them used for buffing armour, so they would have had different types of wheel and different types of compound put on the wheel for these purposes. And in fact we see them being ground, probably the hollow grinding you see on most medieval, well not most, on some medieval swords you see hollow grinding and fullers and things like this, and some of those could have been achieved with grinding wheels, although it's likely that a lot of them were hand ground as well. And we see that in medieval art as well. We see people literally kind of with a special tool, with a stone in a, or something like a stone maybe, in a wooden spar, and basically sort of essentially kind of grinding away, filing away at the groove of the fuller. So there's various different ways, many different ways of skinning a cat, so to speak. So this is just one. I'm going to use a modern grinding wheel. They're fairly inexpensive, obviously it's relatively speaking, depending on how much money you have in your bank account, but relatively to power tools, they're relatively cheap, usually like under £50, so usually £30–40 you can get one. And you can do quite a lot with them, but they're quite brutal. And also health and safety. So I am not telling you to do what I do here. I'm not telling you to copy me. I am going to put safety glasses on. But you will find that a lot of modern grinding wheels have protective casings around the wheels. For various reasons I have taken those off my grinding wheel, which is not advised, and I would not advise you to do that. If the grinding wheel breaks, bits can fly all over the place, and that's rather nasty. But I'm going to wear safety glasses and I'm going to wear gloves. Some people will advise you not to wear gloves for certain types of grinding and polishing and stuff, because the gloves can get caught in the machine, which can be worse than just taking a bit of skin off. Again, I'm not giving any safety advice, so I'm absolving myself of any guilt. I'm only putting myself in harm's way here. I don't advise that necessarily you do anything the way that I do it. I just thought you might like to see some of it. Right, I'm going to get set up now and I'll see you back in a second. Okay, so I've got my grinding wheel here. Obviously while I'm doing it, it's going to be fairly loud, so you know, there's no point me talking at the same time as I'm grinding, because you won't be able to hear me, at least not clearly. I've set it at an angle so you can hopefully see some of what I'm doing. And I'm going to put my safety goggles on. So let's get the machine started. Incidentally, this is never going to be a hewing spear or cutting spear. I'm not aiming to put an edge on it that I could ever really cut anything with. I'm just turning it into a finished weapon, essentially. And I'm looking to put something like a 45-degree bevel on both edges, and of course make the point more pointy, and so I can stab it into things. And I might use it for throwing at some point as well, although this is more of a hand combat spear rather than a throwing spear. So goggles on, got my gloves on, and there we go. I'm sure I look stunning in that now, and let's go. Let's do some grinding. Right, you may notice that I'm just touching. I just realised you may think I'm sniffing the blade. I'm not sniffing it. I'm very quickly and gently touching it on my top lip because I've got gloves on to judge the heat of the blade. Of course, this is a heat-treated blade. It's been hardened and then tempered. I don't want to run the risk of removing whatever hardness I've got on there. You know, I don't want to mess up the heat treat. It's not that important in this specific spear, but it's just general good practice. For this I'm not doing it, but I do sometimes when I'm polishing and grinding with things like felt wheels or even with belt sander type things. I do keep a bucket of water nearby, and I literally just dip the thing in the water every now and again to bring it back down to room temperature, because you don't want to heat it up to a point where you mess up the heat treatment on the blade. But as I say, this is a big chunk of steel, and actually that is not even remotely hot at all. It's very slightly warm. It's like the heat of someone's hand, basically. So no problem with the heat messing up the heat treatment there. The bevel's gone on really, really well, actually. You can see my technique. I'm not that scared. I haven't fixed the wheel onto anything, which generally speaking, of course, I'd advise that you did. If you were using a grinding wheel, I'd fix it down. I just adjust it. It's a fairly heavy object. It's about the weight of a large kettlebell. however much that is, and so it's a fairly heavy object, and I'm not pushing hard against it, I'm actually pushing very gently against it. The movement of this is mostly due to the vibration on the table, and it kind of migrates across the workbench. As it happens, I know that this has a tendency of moving away. Obviously if it had a tendency of moving this way, then I'd probably secure it down because I don't want it falling on my feet. But good practice, you should fix it down. It's just not so easy for me to do that here right now, and I can't be bothered because I knew that I didn't really need to just adjust it. So again, don't follow my safety example. Obey all the normal safety rules. You'll also notice I'm not particularly afraid of getting my leather fingers near this wheel. From years of using these, I actually started using a grinding wheel in my granddad's workshop when I was probably about 13, something like that. And so I'm quite familiar with these. I've never seen one break, incidentally, and I used to use an old machine with, it had lots of old wheels. Part of my family ran an engineering workshop around World War One in West London, and my great-grandfather used to work on aeroplanes for the Royal Flying Corps. So, and in fact my grandfather did as well during the Second World War. They were both engineers, essentially. So I've kind of grown up around these tools. That doesn't mean, again, back in those days people's health and safety was not taken very seriously. It was just more about getting the job done. But the fact is that I've touched these and I've seen what these do, and actually they're not particularly, you're not going to, certainly if you've got leather gloves on, you're not going to do any harm to yourself. So you can afford actually to get quite close to the wheel, and if it rubs against the leather, it doesn't really do anything, it doesn't even scuff the leather much. So incidentally, there are two wheels on these types of grinding wheels. There's usually a rougher one and a smoother one. I'm using the smoother one. The smoother one is better for things like this. The rougher one really is for hogging off more material quicker but rougher, and you can even use it on wood and stuff like that. So I'm using this one. I'm going to get back to it and try and put a bevel on the other side now. I've already established a 45-degree bevel on this side. You can see how quick and easy that was. It took me, less than 5 minutes. So stone works very effectively against steel, and I'm really happy with that actually. It's worked even better than I anticipated. So let's go with get the other side done now as well. So a little word of advice about using tools like this: don't try and rush it. Take your time, stay calm, stop, reassess things often. Don't push too hard, okay? That wheel will take all the steel off that it ever needs to. Just give it time to, okay? Don't expect it to happen instantly. It might take a few minutes, it might take an hour. It depends what you're doing, it depends how much material you're removing, depends how hard the steel is, things like this. Depends even on the angles and the surface area that it's in contact with. So accept that it's going to do the job, but it will take as long as it takes, okay? Don't push too hard and try and do too much at once. It's better to do it in little increments. You're less likely to completely bodge a job and mess it up completely. And if you do a little bit of a wrong grind, you can usually correct it if you're only doing it in small increments like this. I'm very happy with how this is turning out as it is, actually. It's already looking damn good. I'm really happy with this. And because it's going so well, I think what I'll do is I'll carry on and take you through the whole process as well, of sort of start to finish of making this into a spearhead that I'd be happy to have on the end of my shaft, so to speak. Now, you might question, given that this is a pointy thrusty object, probably for stabbing it in the armoured period, stabbing into all sorts of materials, including plate armour, mail, all sorts. Why am I bothering to put an edge on it? And it's all about penetration on this channel, and it's really that, okay? You want relatively, even if you look at a bayonet, okay, bayonets are not designed to cut, well, unless they're a knife bayonet and you're using them as a knife, but generally speaking, when they're on the end of a rifle, most bayonets are not designed to cut, but they are designed to stab. But having edges on, even if it's a triangular socket bayonet, in fact, have I got a socket? No, I don't. I don't have a socket bayonet down here right now, but I've got the scabbard for one, bizarrely. I don't know where the bayonet is. It's probably on the end of one of my rifles. But if you've got an edge on there, it's more likely to go into the target easily, and very, very importantly, as I've spoken about before, it's more likely to come out of the target easily. If you have a rod bayonet, like the number 4 for the spike bayonet for the number 4 Lee Enfield, for example, the pig sticker bayonet, they are more likely to get stuck in things because of the surface area in contact with the thing. If you stick bone, for example, if you stick a round rod, jam it into a bone, you're going to have a lot of surface friction trying to get it back out again. We'll also have a lot of friction going in through things like clothes. So imagine winter clothing, big, trench coat, for example, trying to stab through a woolen trench coat with just essentially a screwdriver is less easy than if you've got a sharp, pointy object, because as the thing enters, it will cut the hole in as it goes in, and it will cut back out again or get back out with less contact, less surface area if needs be. So put that bayonet down. So there we go. So that's why you have edges on a weapon like this. It makes it more effective as a thrusting weapon and makes it easier to get back out again as well. I have to say, extraction with these sorts of weapons is less of an issue because of the design than it is with something like the bayonet, because the bayonet, you'll notice once it's gone into that width, it's the same width all along. Okay, so the problem is you go into there, you've made that hole, and there's really very little to prevent that blade from going all the way up to the hilt. One of the reasons you have a crossguard still. The problem is you've now got that much blade, not just in the target, but right the way through the target and sticking out the back. So therefore you get a lot of friction grip on the surface. Whereas actually with this type of blade, it's got a midrib, strong midrib, which makes it very, very rigid and very, very strong, less likely to bend or break, in fact basically impossible. But because you've got that midrib and you've got this hollow grind, that reduces surface friction because the surfaces leave a hollow against the hollow grind. But in addition, if you look at the shape of the blade, the profile, it means that the hole is continually getting bigger, 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 and it's unlikely that you're ever going to stick something into a target beyond those shoulders. So what you do is essentially you make a hole bigger, 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 and then when you have to pull it out, it's easy because the hole is now bigger than the rest of the blade that needs to come out behind it. Right, let's do a little bit more grinding, and then let's look at sort of making this more pretty and finishing up. I'll just show you very quickly how it's going now. You can probably see the shiny edge bevel on all sides. A little bit rough in places, but not bad at all for just removing material. Remember, this is not the finished product, this is just getting that material off there. Right, let's carry on with a bit of grinding. Right, so I'm bringing the edge bevels down into the point, and that necessitates actually removing a little bit of material from the point, because the point was, if you kind of imagine the edges were like that instead of like that, so when they come to the point is kind of round and fatter than it needs to be and should be. So the point is getting a bit more slender now. Now, what I mentioned previously about the overheating element when you're grinding, that's not a problem on the edges because the body of the blade is nice and fat up here, so there's a lot of material to absorb that friction manifested as heat, a lot of that energy. But when you get to the tip, you're dealing with a smaller amount of material and the tip heats up much, much quicker. If you imagine, for example, you stick this whole thing into a forge, or you put a blowtorch on it, the tip will be very much quicker to get hot because it's a smaller amount of material. This section up here will take longer to heat because there's a big amount of material. So this can absorb a lot more energy than this can absorb because this is smaller. Okay, so less volume. So basically, I'm gonna, to cut a long story short, I'm gonna grab a thing of water so I can keep this cool and dip it in some water as I'm going along. I'm back with my bucket. So here's my bucket of water, nice and handy. I've got plenty of water in there so I can, dunk the whole blade in to cool it down. So there we go. Stick it in there. Specific heat capacity, heat transference. They'll cool down pretty damn quickly. Famously, if you study physics, you'll know that a red hot piece of steel won't burn you as badly as boiling water will, because water contains a lot more energy than steel does. Right, so we're going to carry on removing material. I'm particularly focusing on the tip now, but I'm going to have to keep regularly cooling it down because I don't want to ruin the heat treatment in the tip. That's even more important than the heat treatment in the edges, to be honest, because this isn't a cutting weapon, it's a stabbing weapon. So I want that tip to be as hard and as tough as possible. I don't want it to be easily bent, and I don't want it to, obviously it's not going to crack, that's not my responsibility, that's the person who heat treated it. It's not going to be over hard, but I don't want to make it over soft. Right, let's do a bit more grinding. Also, as I go on, actually, I should mention, you will notice I start to use the sides of the wheel a little bit. This is not perfect form or advised, but I know lots of people who do it, and it's one of the reasons that I took the protective casing off the wheels so that I could get access to the sides of them. Right, I'm really happy with that now, actually. I messed up a couple of the grind angles, but managed to correct it because I was just doing small increments, so I managed to grind over those. What I will do is I'll dismount the camera now and give you a little look at how these bevels look. I'll also put it next to the other one that's blunt and unsharpened behind me, so you can see a comparison between the two. So here we go, guys. Here are the two spearheads. This is the unsharpened blunt one, and you can see from the reflection along the blunt edge how much material I had to remove. It's probably about 2 millimeters, something like that, and fairly thick, very, as you see, very thick, nicely forged, beautifully forged mid-rib, and the point, because the edges are, see if I can get my hand in there, because the edges are thick, you can see that it comes down to a fairly thick point as well. So here is my freshly ground one, and you can see the reflection along the edge bevels that I've just put on. Okay, and obviously I had to correspondingly remove some material from the tip there. The grind obviously is, I won't call it rough, but you can see the grind marks to some degree, which I'm now going to remove in a way that I'll show you in a second. But I'm very happy with that. It now has a sharp edge bevel on both sides of about a 40-45 degree angle. Probably more like 45, and the tip is now more pointy and ground down and flat, and it corresponds to the edge bevel itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to smooth those bevels sharpen them, and then I'm going to polish the weapon. So let's have a little look at that. But there we go. There is blunt versus, or kind of almost blunt versus almost sharp. And I hope you can see the contrast quite nicely between those two. Hey folks, so here's the next stage. So as I mentioned before, there are many different ways to skin a cat. There are many ways to do this next stage. You could do it with a file, you could do it with sandpaper, you could do it with a sanding disc on a drill, you could do it with a bench grinder, all kinds of things. But what I'm going to use is what I have to hand, which is something that I bought. It's known as the Work Sharp. There we go. The Work Sharp knife and tool sharpener, and it's kind of pitched as it's a mini, let's face it, it's a mini belt grinder. It's a mini belt grinder, handheld tool, and it's pitched as the ultimate answer to sharpen all your tools and all your knives. Is it? No, not really. I'm not a huge fan of it. I actually find that it's a bit too aggressive. It depends obviously what type of grit sandpaper you use, but I find if you've got good quality knives and things that you want to be fairly careful with, I always prefer hand sharpening. And I'm not really a fan of machines like this because it's too easy to mess up. It's too easy to grind at the wrong angle, in the wrong place, and it's also very easy, and I think a lot of people using these tools and belt grinders don't necessarily think about this, very easy to overheat the edge and soften it. So yes, you're making it sharp, but it won't stay sharp for very long because you've overheated the edge and you've removed the heat treatment. Just so easy to do that when you're dealing with very, very thin pieces of steel. So I'm not a huge fan of these, but they're useful for certain jobs, and I found for this sort of job where you're dealing with a fairly large clod of steel, fairly large lump of steel, and so long as you stop regularly and cool it down, then that's fine, which they, as far as I know, they don't really tell you to do with these, but you're supposed to if you want to maintain your heat treatment well. So not a big fan of these, but for this job it works well. They're about £100. I don't particularly recommend them, to be honest, unless I've been using it wrong and there are some secrets to making them work fantastically. I don't find that they do work fantastically. Belt grinders are fantastic for knife making, but personally I'm always a fan of hand sharpening. Because it's just a lot kinder to your tool or weapon, but it takes more skill and it takes more time to do, takes more time to learn. Anyway, let's do a little bit of work on that spearhead with this, and then we'll look to polish up the spearhead, and then it'll be pretty much done after that. You'll notice I'm not using any of the kind of jigs or formers for this because it won't fit in any of them. So you have to do it by eye basically, but I know a lot of knife makers and sword makers who do everything by eye anyway. Their eye is probably a lot better than mine, but it does for the purposes of this. What this is doing is very similar to what the grinding wheel did. It's just doing it a little bit more subtly, a little more smoothly, producing more of a polished finish. So as you can see, the workshop, one thing it does have going for it is you can do different angles and move it around. It's relatively safe. The worst you could do is take a little bit of skin off with it. It doesn't really, even if it touches your clothes, it doesn't do much. So it's pretty safe thing, easy to use, electric. Now, one other thing, that because you can get different angles and stuff, there are a couple of dull spots on the blade here. Now, obviously, I'm not looking to make this into like something I can shave with or anything like that, but that would be kind of fun. Kind of weird as well. There are a couple of spots where the bevels don't quite meet up. There's like a little, I can see the glint of light along them. So this is good at getting in there and working on that. And I've got a little bit left to do. One edge is pretty much there, I think. I'm happy with where the point is at. There's maybe a tiny bit more to do on the point. So I'm going to continue doing that with this tool, and it's quite versatile for that at least. But as I say, you could do this with hand tools. You could do it with a file, normal handheld file. You could do it even with sandpaper glued to a wooden block or something like that. Well, you know what? I'm fairly happy with that. It's certainly pretty damn pointy now, so that will stab through all sorts of things, which I guess is what you want from a spear. So all I'm going to do now is finish off. I'm going to buff this up a bit. You don't need to. Most spears historically would not have been buffed up, but why the devil not? I love buffing things. I love cleaning, polishing. It's probably one of my favourite things to do, actually, of all the kind of handicraft stuff I do, is cleaning and polishing. Can't explain why, I just love a good buff. So let's give this a buff up, and then we'll show you some close-ups of it, and I'll wrap this thing up. I'm just going to go and cool that down. It's getting a little bit hot to handle now. So the polishing compound that you use on these wheels leaves a kind of greasy black mess all over the blades. WD-40, which is my go-to oil for all sorts of things. You can see it's steaming because the blades got fairly warm. WD-40 cleans it right off, completely dissolves it pretty much instantly. Use an obviously old rag to wipe off the residue, and then a cleaner one to get off the final bit of it. And let's have a little look at the blade. Pretty much finished off. I'll give it a final sharpen at some point, but it's certainly sharp enough to use, so to speak. And obviously it needs fitting onto a shaft, which I won't show here. Let's look at this blade compared to its blunt compatriot and see how it started off and how it finished. So here we go, here are the two blades. That's how it started off. Fairly dull finish, thick edges, pointy-ish, but you know, fairly thick at the point. And this is the I won't say finished, but this is the Matt Easton modified version with edge bevels applied. If you can see the reflection of those, there we go, and there, and other side. Edge bevels put in, nice pointy tip. Youch! Yep, that's super pointy, and you can see I have buffed it up. I've polished it up so it looks like a finished product now. I know that some people prefer a satin finish, and some of you will say, "Oh, the satin looks nicer." That's fine. You have a satin finish, but I like things to look like they're kind of polished and finished. And I think in the medieval period people did appreciate a shiny object. There's lots of references to things being polished up to bright mirror polish. There we go, and I think it makes it look like more of a finished object. So I'm actually super happy. This actually turned out better even than I thought it could and would do. I thought the edges were too fat to be brought to a decent conclusion, but actually it's worked really, really well, and I'm really happy with how pointy that is now. So I just have to fit that up onto a shaft. Maybe I'll do something fancy with the shaft because I'm quite happy with this head, and this is pretty much a perfect kind of fiore or kind of you know, 15th century basically armoured fighting spear. Well, not just armoured, but to face armoured and non-armoured opponents. So I'm very happy with that. It's beautifully forged. I love the really, really strong midrib, and I love the way that the edges and the midrib converge into this really nice diamond, almost bodkin-like tip. You know, pretty much a reinforced, well, definitely a reinforced tip for thrusting through things like mail and gambeson and stuff like that, and maybe on a lucky day through a thinner piece of plate armour as well. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope this has been entertaining to some degree. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and maybe share your ideas for other projects I could do. I've certainly got loads of I've got other polearm heads that actually need doing similar things to this around, so if you enjoyed this video, let me know and I'll make more videos like it. Thanks for watching, folks. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.